Is Queen Esther a picture or symbol of the end-time bride of Christ? Is her role found in the book of Esther a long, multi-chapter, prophetic picture of our end-time church? If so, almost everybody's missing it. And that's what we're going to talk about today, and we're starting right now. The book of Esther can be read on two levels. The first level is that it is historic truth. The events were real. They took place in ancient Persia, not long after the ministry of Daniel the prophet. Second level is that as a foreshadow of the end-time events, it is an amazing map for us of what is going to happen. Esther is a beloved book with one of the great heroines of the Bible. All three of my daughters used to love this book growing up. It's also a challenged book, as it is the only book in the Bible where the name of God isn't mentioned. And as many have pointed out, it wasn't found in the Dead Sea Scrolls' original texts, leading many to question whether it should even be in the canon of Scripture. But as you may know, over 50 years ago, archaeologists did find a scroll in Qumran that was unreadable as a result of a 2,000-year-old wine spill. But two recent scientific breakthroughs finally made reading this ancient wine-soaked parchment possible. And guess what? It appears to be an early version of the book of Esther. Possibly the wine soak is an over-exuberant Purim celebration. We're going to talk about Purim at the end of the video. So that eliminates any contention about the Dead Sea Scroll issue. In terms of not mentioning God by name, the sovereignty and power of God is demonstrated in this book, perhaps more than most other books of the Bible. So this ministry has absolutely no problem with the canonicity of it at all. So how does the book of Esther foreshadow end-time prophecies? Well, wicked Prince Haman symbolizes the Antichrist. Esther symbolizes the church who intercedes for the Jews. The king is God himself. And Mordecai is the Messianic Jewish movement. The 127 provinces that gather together in a feast at the beginning of the account might be the United Nations. And events take place in Persia, which is the modern nation of Iran. So those are our best guesses as to the symbolism of the book. Let's take a look at the symbols one at a time. Haman is a picture of the Antichrist, and his very name means rage, which is appropriate for the Antichrist. His lineage was that of an Amalekite, a descendant of Agag, and an Edomite, all enemies of God. Edom, in fact, were the enemies of the Jews, and God plans to judge them specifically on the day of the Lord. So all this fits with someone who might represent the Antichrist. In Hebrew, the word enemy or oppressor is sorer, and Haman is called this 4 separate times. Esther 3:10, 8:1, 9:10, and 9:24. Like Haman, the Antichrist will be the enemy and oppressor of the Jews and Christians and will kill and persecute them. Haman's hatred for the Jews begins when Mordecai refuses to bow down before him in Esther 3:6. He not only wants revenge on Mordecai, but also on all his relatives, all the Jews. As we see in the New Testament, Antichrist will kill everyone who doesn't bow down before the image of the beast. Now, Esther is a picture of the bride of Christ. Esther wasn't even her real name. Esther was her Persian name, and it means star. Her Jewish name was Hadassah, meaning myrtle tree. Myrtle trees might be a symbol then of the bride of Christ. We find the colored horses of Zechariah 1, which are symbolic of the 4 horsemen later in Revelation, and they are among the myrtle trees. Supporting this idea is a verse from Isaiah. Instead of the thorn bush, the juniper will come up, and instead of the stinging nettle, the myrtle will come up, and it will be a name to the Lord, an everlasting sign which will not be eliminated. Myrtle is a symbol then of a regenerated creation, taking stinging nettles and turning them into myrtle. Just like Christians are regenerated creations. I happen to personally have 11 myrtles in my yard at home. I love that type of tree. Obedient as she was, Esther or Hadassah kept her identity secret, only revealing it at the crucial time to her husband the king. And so she was able to be a vessel for the deliverance of her entire race. She has Jewish roots, but no one in the palace knows it. So when she finds out about the upcoming persecution, she at first tries to avoid the tribulation that is coming upon the Jews, but then finds out she can't escape. It's because she is also a Jew, and even though she's a hidden one, her own destiny is linked to them. This ministry sees this as a very likely way that things will play out in the end times. It is likely that persecution will begin in Israel and spread to Jews worldwide. But most Christians at the beginning will think it's only a Jewish problem. But then, after God hides the Jewish remnant, it will shift to the Christians, as we learn in Revelation 12. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and drank up the river, which the dragon had hurled out of his mouth. So the dragon was enraged with the woman, and went off to make war with the rest of her children, who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. That's the Christians. So Esther is called to intercede for the Jews. She hesitates, and Mordecai tells her this famous passage. If you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Although she is frightened by this call to risk her own life, she decides to accept her prophetic destiny. It's through her grace, prayer, and fasting that disaster is turned into victory and the kingdom is delivered to the saints. So that is the basic outline of the prophetic story and characters. Haman's part of the story begins when the king, representing God, gives Haman his signet ring, Esther 3:10. This is symbolic of God granting authority to the Antichrist for 3.5 years. And as we said, when Mordecai refuses to bow down, Haman's anger and hatred rises. This will be true of the Jewish remnant in the end times who refuse to bow to Antichrist. At the end of the book of Esther, this ring, this signet ring of the king, is eventually given to Mordecai, showing that the people of God eventually are given the dominion and kingdom as per Daniel 7. Interestingly, an exact date is given when Haman receives authority from the king to exterminate the Jews. That date was Nisan 13. The day before Passover, Nisan 14, the Passover season is the time most scholars believe the Antichrist will assume power and perform the Abomination of Desolation. So this is a very interesting, specific date in Scripture. A possible parallel to God granting the Antichrist authority for 42 months. Now, will the 42 months begin on a future Nisan 13? We don't know, but it is certainly something to consider. Haman's request to kill the Jews is then sent to all 127 provinces, which, as we mentioned before, we think symbolically might be the United Nations. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces to annihilate, kill, and destroy all the Jews, both young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to seize their possessions as plunder. Notice that the possessions of God's people were to be taken as well. This will happen in the end times, as those not taking the mark of the beast will have everything taken away. Also, a specific day is outlined when the genocide is to take place as well, exactly 11 months after the decree. Now, how this plays out in the end times, this ministry isn't completely sure. If you have an idea, leave a comment below this video. Some of the best ideas come from our community. So if this is truly a prophetic picture of the end times, will a decree be sent out to all the nations to kill the Jews? Well, maybe. Esther, who is a picture of the Christians, hears about this decree and is determined to help. But now, in order for Esther to prevent this genocide, she must go to the king and beg him directly to protect the Jews and herself. But in those days, the punishment for anyone appearing before the king unannounced could be death, unless the king extended his golden scepter and gave permission. The parallel here is that no living person is allowed to see God the Father. So how does Esther get to the king? How do Christians get to God the Father? Esther asked all the Jews in the capital to fast and pray for her for 3 days. And on the 3rd day, Esther appeared and approached the king upon his throne and was given permission to approach him. When do Christians appear before the throne of the Father? It's in Revelation 7:9, after the 6th seal and the rapture. And when do the prayers of those Christians ascend before the Father? In a previous video, we've talked how that happens in Revelation 8:1-4, after the 7th seal. It is then that the prayers ascend to the Father and the punishment of the wicked begins. 2 other symbols in the Esther account point to this timing. First, on the night before Esther comes to the king had the transcripts of the kingdom read to him and learned of one of Mordecai's good deeds. Mordecai had once saved the king's life. This idea, though, of opening a scroll and reading about a person's prior acts is exactly parallel to the books being opened before God judges the world, and the deeds of all being read before him. This happens before the rapture in Daniel 7, verses 9 and 10. Second, Esther and the king attend a great feast. Is this somewhat symbolic of the marriage supper of the Lamb in heaven? Well, possibly. So all these things point to a timing of the rapture, when the bride appears before God in heaven and makes intercession before him for the Jews. In the historic account, the king is infuriated once he hears that Haman was trying to kill the queen and her people, and he storms off into the gardens. Haman then pleads with the queen and accidentally stumbles onto her couch right at the moment the king re-enters, and he believes Haman is trying to assault the queen. He is immediately taken out and hung on the very gallows he built for Mordecai. This also matches the prophetic picture as the Antichrist attempts to steal the bride of Christ from the Lord. The Jewish feast of Purim and the fast of Esther that precedes it are Jewish holidays based on this account. So these days were to be remembered and celebrated throughout every generation, every family, every province, every city, and these days of Purim were not to be neglected by the Jews or their memory fade from their descendants. Now Hanukkah is another Jewish holiday that has strong end-time symbolism. Click right here to keep watching and find out how Hanukkah symbolically describes the Great Tribulation and the Abomination of Desolation. Till then, this is Nelson, and I'll see you there.